Hey there, Explorettes! Welcome back to my channel. I'm Chelsea and you're watching Chelsea Explores. In this video, I'm going to be answering all your questions regarding whether or not you can travel to Europe during COVID. If you didn't know, my husband and I recently traveled across Europe for 2.5 months. So I am here to give you the insider scoop on how you too can travel to Europe during COVID. And if you're interested, you can check out all my Europe videos on my YouTube channel to find more inspiration on things like how we prepared our house for traveling Europe and fun places to visit like Cinque Terre. Now, obviously things are ever changing, so before you book those tickets, make sure to do your own research as well. I just wanted to share our experience and help calm your nerves a bit because I think the media overdoes it on how scared we should be for traveling, especially in Europe. And I am here to tell you that it is not as scary or daunting as the media may make it seem. Or at least that's my personal opinion. So was it confusing to figure out? Yes, absolutely. But is it doable? Absolutely. Let's get to the most asked question that I had. Do I have to be vaccinated to travel to Europe? Let's dive in. Now this answer and question is actually a bit complicated, but I'm gonna try to break it down for you. So let's first talk about all the places that my husband and I visited. We went to 5 different countries. We started out in Iceland and then headed over to Italy, stayed there for a month. From Italy, we headed to Greece and did Athens and Santorini. From there, we went to Spain and did Barcelona and Madrid. And we ended up in Zurich, Switzerland and did a day trip to Zermatt, Switzerland. So I am going to go into each country that we personally visited and what was required of us at that time. Here are some basic things that we just found during our research when preparing to visit these places. Personally, all the countries that we chose allowed vaccinated travelers. Some of these countries still required a negative PCR test though, even if you were vaccinated. Now, the second piece to this puzzle is whether or not you could travel to these countries being unvaccinated. Again, the answer is confusing, but there was kind of like a loophole, I guess you could say, or another way around it. I don't want to call it a loophole, but if you have had COVID and recovered from it in the last 14 to 180 days, you were allowed to travel throughout these countries without being vaccinated. You had to have COVID during that time frame and have had proof that you have had COVID during that time frame in order to travel to these countries. If you have recovered from COVID in that time frame, then no quarantine was required of you. If you were unvaccinated, you could still travel to these places, however, a quarantine might have been required. Okay, so let's break it down by each country. I have my notes here because it's just gonna be easier for me to look at them and give you the exact knowledge that I had when traveling to these countries. But again, things might have changed by now. This is just our experience. So let's start with the first country, Iceland. So for Iceland, both vaccinated and unvaccinated are allowed to travel there. If you are vaccinated, you still needed to provide a negative test taken within 72 hours of your plane departure. Passengers who had recovered from COVID-19 within that 14 to 180 day time frame needed to show proof of a positive PCR specifically test taken within that time range prior to the flight. But technically, they did not need to show a negative test if they have recovered from COVID. Now, why is that? That is because you can actually still test positive for COVID within that time frame. So as long as you can show proof that you've recovered from it within the 14 to 180 days, Iceland did not require you to have a negative PCR test within the last 72 hours. However, I would still recommend getting that test because airline employees and all these rules are very confusing. So to just have it on hand would be nice. A pre-registration form is also required prior to entering Iceland, which we found to be very common for all of our European travels. So I'm going to link the form in the description box below, and this has to be done before you enter Iceland. Unvaccinated US travelers were allowed into Iceland as long as they can prove that they are a true US resident, but they had to show a negative PCR test result taken no more than 72 hours before departure, and they had to enter a 5-day quarantine. So, moving on to Italy, vaccinated US travelers were allowed, as well as, again, those who recovered from COVID within that 14 to 180 days. For both of those people, both those categories, you were allowed in with a negative COVID-19 test result, again, taken no more than 72 hours before arrival. This could have been an antigen or a PCR test. So that's one important thing to research ahead of time, is whether or not it needs to be an antigen or a PCR test. Again, a passenger locator form is required to enter the country, and I will link it in the description box below. At the time, unvaccinated travelers were allowed in with a negative COVID-19 test result, but again had to enter a 5-day quarantine. At the end of the 5-day quarantine, they were also required to take an antigen or PCR test and in order to leave self-isolation. Alright, so let's move on to Greece. So vaccinated US travelers are allowed without any testing, as well as, again, those people who can prove that they've had COVID, but in the past 30 to 180 days. Unvaccinated travelers were allowed, but they must have taken a COVID-19 PCR test and received a negative result no more than 72 hours prior to departure of the flight, or a negative rapid antigen test result taken no more than 48 hours. Okay, let's move on to our 5th and final country, Spain. Again, vaccinated and those who have recovered from COVID were allowed in. You had to download a QR code generated through the Spanish portal, and I will link that portal below where you can obtain the QR code. Unfortunately, at that time, unvaccinated US travelers were not allowed in. Lastly was Switzerland. Now, I believe these rules definitely have changed since we visited, because when we were flying out, I believe the rules were changing that day. When we went to Switzerland, vaccinated and those recovered from COVID were allowed to enter with a negative COVID test. However, the rules have changed, and I believe now everyone must take a COVID-19 test before entering, as well as between days 4 and 7 after arrival, antigen or PCR. At this time, in this current situation, I believe unvaccinated travelers are not allowed in Switzerland. So, when you are doing your research, you may find something called the Green Pass, which was what Italy called it. It was pretty common across Europe, and almost all Europeans have this Green Pass. It was very confusing and difficult to figure out if US people need this, and if so, how to obtain it. The Green Pass is the EU's version of the digital COVID pass. To be honest, I'm surprised the US doesn't have this yet. So the EU digital COVID certificate, otherwise the EU Green Pass, or your EU vaccination certificate, is an electronic record that clears passengers as safe to travel around the EU, and it comes in a form of a QR code on an app. For those who live in Europe, being vaccinated is not the only way to get this pass or QR code. There are a few other ways that people obtain this Green Pass. You get a QR code if you've tested negative within 72 hours, if you've recovered from COVID-19, or if you have the vaccine. So can you get an EU Green Pass as an American citizen? Again, we found this very difficult. We asked multiple pharmacies when we were there if we could obtain the Green Pass, and with the language barrier and the confusion of just COVID in general, it was quite difficult to say that we wanted it. They were confused as to why we were asking for it when we had vaccine cards or proof of recovery, and they would not just give us the QR code. When we did get tested for COVID for traveling purposes at these pharmacies or at COVID testing centers, we did obtain a QR code, but you need to ask them or have them show you how to obtain that QR code, because it's not as easy as you think. They don't just hand it to you. You have to download an app and then put information in, and it's much easier if they help you. Most places we visited allowed us to just show, again, our vaccine card or the proof of recovery papers, but there was a few places that were confused as to why we didn't have the QR code or Green Pass, and it just took some explaining. But we were, all in all, able to do everything we wanted to do, being a U.S. American citizen while traveling through Europe. Now, obviously, there are a ton of other countries in Europe, so you're going to have to do your own research when it comes to traveling throughout these countries, as things are ever changing. Overall, at that time, I would say most countries allowed both unvaccinated and vaccinated travelers to travel throughout their country, just with different criteria, whether that be PCR tests versus rapid antigen tests, whether that be some days of quarantining upon arrival if you are unvaccinated. It just takes doing your own research and seeing what you are okay with. I'm actually going to link an article in the description box below that lists out all the European countries and what their current rules are for traveling during these crazy COVID times. So that should be helpful for you. Okay, that was a lot of information. So if you're still with me, don't forget to like and subscribe on this video, as I will be sharing tons more stuff with you, whether that be destination guides, traveling throughout Europe, pregnancy tips, and much, much more. So let's get back into traveling through Europe during COVID and whether it's possible or not. So another popular question that I got was, how do we find legitimate COVID testing sites? And whether to know if the price was fair or not. And that's a great question. Honestly, we found getting COVID tested in Europe was way easier than getting a COVID test done in the US. So what I'm finding in San Diego is that it's extremely hard to get a COVID test. Prior to flying out to our first location, Iceland, I had the most difficult time finding a place that would offer us a COVID test without booking out weeks in advance. Let me tell you, it's not like that in Europe. There are literally places to get COVID tested, which seems like on every corner. First of all, Europe has pharmacies literally on every corner, and most of those pharmacies do COVID testing. Most of them are just a walk-in kind of place. There are very few that do require you to make an appointment, but usually you can get a same-day appointment for those COVID tests at the pharmacies, which is crazy to me that it's not like that here in the US. Venice and Switzerland were the two places that required us to make an online appointment, but again, we were able to get those appointments on the same day, so I would not stress about whether or not you're going to be able to get a COVID test prior to booking your flight or prior to riding a train that requires it. It's so much easier over there and so much more convenient. As for cost, that really depended on the country that we were in. Now, the countries we visited, Iceland and Switzerland, were definitely the most expensive countries. Italy, Greece, and Spain, the testing and overall cost of things in general was much, much lower. The costs ranged from $20 US to $50 US, with Switzerland being the most expensive. And it was more expensive to get tested in airports and train stations. So if you can find a testing center outside of those areas, it is going to be a cheaper cost for you. However, sometimes the convenience of just getting tested right then and there in the airport or at the train station is worth the extra dollar signs. The results would come back within like 15 to 20 minutes, so it would be perfect. You could just grab a coffee while you wait for your test and then hop on the train. Overall, getting a rapid antigen test was definitely the cheaper option, and every place we went accepted the rapid antigen test as a form of negative COVID test, so PCR was not needed for anywhere we went. Back to my original question. Do you need to be vaccinated to travel Europe? The short answer is no. But the long answer is it's definitely going to be a lot harder for you to travel throughout Europe. There's a lot more restrictions if you are unvaccinated. But I don't want to discourage you from traveling if you are unvaccinated just because it sounds hard. You may have to quarantine. You may have to do more testing, but it is definitely still doable to travel regardless of being your vaccination status. That is not me necessarily encouraging you for medical reasons, like medical purposes, to travel unvaccinated. You do what you think is safe for you and everyone else. But I'm here to just give you the facts that you can travel Europe vaccinated, you can travel Europe unvaccinated, and you can travel Europe showing proof of recovery of COVID within the last 14 to 180 days. And I'm here to just tell you that it's doable, it's possible. The media makes it sound so difficult and so hard to travel throughout Europe with COVID going on, and it's not as scary as they make it sound, both the traveling side and actually being over there. To be honest, I felt more safe in Europe than I do here in San Diego. Everyone wears masks there, outside, on the trains, on the buses, indoors, in restaurants. People are just wearing masks. And traveling throughout Europe, I honestly felt safer than here in my own home in San Diego. So again, I'm here to just encourage you and tell you that there are more steps you have to take in order to get to Europe, and things you have to do once you get there, and it might be a little confusing, but it is not impossible, and we can still explore this world. And that's what I'm here to do as Chelsey Explores, is to encourage you to travel and get out there and see all the beautiful things that this world has to offer. So I hope you liked this video. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next Tuesday for another video on my channel at Chelsey Explores. Thanks for watching.